So we heard in the last lecture, if water is the problem, if fluid overload or better fluid accumulation is an issue, then de-resuscitation or fluid removal may be the solution to treat and save our patients. So let's kick off with an introduction. A big black hole, FAS, fluid accumulation syndrome. As the word says, it's a syndrome. It's not a disease, and it can occur within many disease states and situations. But the problem is that most surgeons and intensivists, anesthetists, do not pay attention to perioperative fluid accumulation. Let me illustrate this with a typical case of an abdominal sepsis, fecal peritonitis, arriving in the ICU on day 0, blood pressure drops, give a bag of saline. Urine output drops, let's give another bag of saline. CVP is low, or mean systemic filling pressure is low, let's give some more saline. And at the end of the day, the patient may have received a couple of bags of fluids, necessary or unnecessary, because it's kind of a reflex. Whenever something goes wrong, give some fluids. So on day 2, we can see that the abdomen is distended, creatinine is increasing. And on day 4, there's a further increase in creatinine, urine output drops, and there is a positive cumulative fluid balance of 7 liters. On day 7, sudden cardiac arrest in the ICU because of mesenteric ischemia and abdominal compartment syndrome, maybe a little bit iatrogenic because of fluid accumulation. So we know that intra-abdominal pressure is a killer. But the question is, did you do everything to prevent fluid accumulation syndrome? Did you think fluid stewardship, fluids as drugs? So today will be about breaking some bad habits. And that's why we created the International Fluid Academy, now already 13 years ago, in Antwerp, with a mission to foster education and training, to promote research on fluid therapy by organizing international collaboration. And another reason I got an interest in fluids is that when I was a medical student, I exactly received 0.0 hours of education and training on fluid therapy. Yet, 1 patient in 5 will develop complications from inappropriate fluid administration. 1 in 5 is 20%. It's quite a lot. And this may be either too little or too much fluids. So that's why, and previous speakers alluded to, drug dose duration de-escalation. We know this from antibiotic stewardship, and it's just similar for fluids. So another reason why I got this interest is that when we performed an international survey of about 1,000 healthcare providers all over the world, the average knowledge score on fluid therapy was 46%. So we did not pass the test. And if I would do the test here, it would be the same because it's the same everywhere. When we run Fluid Academy meetings, sometimes we have polling with the audience. And when we ask what would be the ideal maintenance solution, most often they choose for an isotonic solution. Well, we learn from studies that hypotonic balanced solutions are the best. So we do make mistakes because we are humans and to err is human. But let's forget about the mistakes and remember the lessons. So to help you with this, the International Fluid Academy provides some guidance, and we publish open access publications. Like this paper in Annals of Intensive Care is still being number 1, I think, from accessed and downloaded papers. We provide some guidance on how to implement fluid stewardship, fluids in the perioperative phase, fluids in COVID-19 patients. The introduction of the sodium burden being even more important than the fluid burden. Fluids in special conditions, like one of my favorites is patients with intra-abdominal hypertension. And a recent paper that was published is a multidisciplinary expert panel that exactly helps you how to start with fluid stewardship in your hospital. But I'm very happy and very proud to announce our book that has been launched a couple of weeks ago on rational use of IV fluids. And you can just go to the Springer website and download it. I checked, and it has already been downloaded 473,000 times. Tells me 2 things. When things are free, People like it, but it also shows that there is a lot of interest and eagerness to learn more about fluid stewardship. So I invite you to have a look at the book. So before COVID, we started to organize these pop-up meetings, International Fluid Academy Days, 1 day or 2 day meetings like we did in Amsterdam, in Mexico City, in Valencia in Spain in 2019. Then we went to Brazil in Sao Paulo, in Rio de Janeiro, and in Campinas, where we also had an abdominal hypertension meeting. And last year, then there was COVID. The idea was to come to Philippines and Malaysia in 2020, but we all know what happened then. And last year, we went to Indonesia and Palembang in Jakarta, as well as beautiful Bali. More recently, we did a tour in the United Arab Emirates, in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and then in Kuwait City, where always there are very enthusiastic young and older doctors wanting to implement fluid stewardship. And today, I'm very honored to be here with you in Manila during this postgraduate course.
The world moves in real time. So should our healthcare technology. With information needed, decisions to make, and experience to share, every second counts. Live integrated tele-ultrasound enables real-time communication, remote collaboration, confidence, knowledge, and learning. The first ever integrated tele-ultrasound collaborative platform. Philips Lumify. Integrated tele-ultrasound, powered by React's collaborative platform. Innovation and you, Philips.
So let's make things complicated. D1 is definitions. D2 is diagnosis. D3 is drug, D4 dose, D5 duration, D6 de-escalation. So those are the 4 Ds you already heard of. And D7 documentation may even be the most important one. So when we have D1 to D7 and we multiply, we have D to the power of 7, and this is fluid stewardship. This is what we should be doing in the ICU in the hospital. So let's kick off with the one on definitions. We heard that fluid overload will lead to hypervolemia, hyperhydration, and peripheral edema. And we know that hypervolemia, because of hydrostatic forces, always lead to peripheral edema, anasarca even. But the opposite is not always true. So that's why Jean-Louis Vincent suggested maybe we should avoid the term fluid overload and talk about fluid accumulation instead. And everything you need to know on fluid de-resuscitation can be found in this open access paper, where we suggest the definition of fluid accumulation that you can calculate either by looking at daily body weight, daily and cumulative fluid balance, or bioelectrical impedance analysis, and referring this to the baseline body weight. Because we heard that most of the fluids are intracellular, 33% extracellular, and then 1/4 of those are intravascular. But when we talk about fluid accumulation, it's mainly the extracellular fluids, the interstitial fluids. When we talk about hypervolemia, it's mainly the intravascular fluids. And there may be some confusion within these terms. A fluid accumulation syndrome would then be defined as any percentage fluid accumulation with new onset organ failure that, of course, is associated with fluid overload, like intestinal edema, like pulmonary edema, and so forth. And this can be accompanied by Gibbs. There are many more definitions, but because of time's sake, I will not go into detail. They can all be found in the open access book. Let's move to D2, is on diagnosis. We know that hypovolemia is bad, but maybe hypervolemia and fluid accumulation can be worse. That's why it's so important to predict fluid responsiveness. And in this paper, we summarize some of the latest tests like the passive leg raise, the end expiratory occlusion test, and so forth. Prediction of fluid responsiveness is important and can or cannot be accompanied with a fluid status that is either very low or very high, leading to fluid accumulation with peripheral edema that is pronounced or little. And in between is a new concept, which is fluid tolerance, the maximum amount of fluids that we can give to a patient without causing organ dysfunction. And Professor Tobul will talk about this later. When we arrive at the stage that the patient becomes fluid unresponsive with venous congestion, then he may end up in a state of fluid intolerance. And the risk of fluid accumulation syndrome will be determined by the interplay between fluid responsiveness and fluid tolerance. And just to show you that things are complicated, a recent paper by the group of Philip Rolla, where they looked at patients who were fluid responsive and unresponsive, and you can see that also the ones who are fluid responsive can have venous congestion grade 1 and grade 2, whereas the fluid unresponders with venous congestion can have absence of venous congestion and be fluid responsive as well. So it's very complicated, and the syndromes and patterns overlap. That's why the fluid status is so important. But there are many myths and misunderstandings, like not all septic patients are hypovolemic. And as I told you, it's not because you have peripheral edema that we need to give diuretics. Just because you're a fluid responder doesn't mean that fluids need to be given. And there is this video I found on Twitter, and I think it's very interesting. It shows when you squeeze and you give vasopressors, you decrease the unstressed volume, you recruit stressed volume, and you improve venous return. Because why septic patients at the very beginning may just be vasoplegic, not necessarily hypovolemic. And blood pressure needs to be high in order to have a sufficient perfusion pressure. When we combine the MAP with the CVP, mean systemic filling pressure, at the end of the organs, we have organ perfusion pressure, and this is important. And this shows why in patients with intra-abdominal hypertension, where they have a high intra-abdominal pressure, they will have a higher CVP, perfusion pressure to the organs will be less. So maybe there may be a place for vasodilators like nitroglycerin has been a study in Holland to improve perfusion pressure to the organs. So fluid status matters, and we heard in the previous lecture that most of the fluid's intracellular, but it's also important to understand differences between osmolality, which will determine the tolerability of a fluid, as well as the tonicity, the effective osmolality, which is mainly based on the sodium levels, and this will determine the distribution of a volume. So as said, 60% of the body is water, and only a little amount consists the intravascular fluids. So if I would give 1 liter of saline, considered being isotonic, what happens with this 1 liter after 1 hour? Only 25% will remain intravascular. If I would give a hypertonic solution, and these are not solutions for resuscitation, only 80 cc will remain intravascular. And colloids, after 1 hour, they will remain about 100% intravascular.